There are 10 files on my desk tonight, each one once read, classified. In one file, the CIA ran a chain of government-funded brothels in San Francisco. There is a file about a gun that could cause a heart attack and leave no trace. In another file, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, every single one of them, signed a memo proposing that the United States military staged terrorist attacks on American soil. And in the thickest file of all, the one I have been putting off, is the story of a program so reckless that the CIA director ordered 80% of its records destroyed. They almost succeeded. Almost. These are not conspiracy theories. Every operation I will describe tonight has been confirmed by declassified documents, testimonies, or the admissions of the agencies themselves. The only question, the one that never quite gets answered, is what happened to the people who did these things. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. Now, before we begin tonight, I want to ask you something. Not a trivia question, something personal. What is one thing you once believed about the world, something you held as fact that you later learned was not true? Write it in the comments, just to share. I'll go first. I grew up believing that if something was truly illegal, truly immoral, someone would eventually be held responsible. A hearing, a trial, a resignation. But the longer I've lived, the clearer it's become. Accountability isn't guaranteed. It's optional. In the early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency had a problem. The Korean War had produced disturbing reports of American prisoners of war who appeared to have been brainwashed. Soldiers who denounced their own country confessed to war crimes they had not committed and seemed to have been psychologically reprogrammed by their Chinese and North Korean captors. The CIA believed that the Soviets and Chinese had developed techniques for controlling the human mind. Whether or not this was true, and the evidence suggests it was vastly exaggerated, the fear was real. And in the intelligence community, fear has always been a budget line. The agency's response was MKUltra, the most extensive and most reckless program of human experimentation in American history. We will open that file later tonight. But first, I want to tell you about one of MKUltra's sub-projects. Sub-project 3, the one they called Operation Midnight Climax. Because Operation Midnight Climax is in many ways the purest distillation of everything that went wrong with American intelligence in the 20th century. It is absurd. It is criminal. It lasted for over a decade, and absolutely no one was ever punished for any of it. The man at the center of this story is George Hunter White. White was not a CIA officer. He was an agent of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the precursor to the DEA. But the line between the two agencies in the 1950s was not a line at all. It was a revolving door, and White walked through it whenever it suited him. His background is worth understanding because it tells you something about the kind of person the agency found useful. White had applied to the FBI twice. He was rejected both times. Bureau evaluators noted that his personality was not up to Bureau standards. He was eventually hired by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1936, but only after a United States senator personally interceded on his behalf. During World War II, White served in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. There, he trained a generation of intelligence officers, including two men who would later become directors of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms and William Colby. The man whom the FBI found temperamentally unsuitable was shaping the future leadership of American espionage. White was, by multiple accounts, a large man with large appetites. He drank martinis by the pitcher. He was described by people who worked with him as displaying the hallmarks of a sadist. He was also effective. And in the world of covert operations, effectiveness has always outweighed character. In 1953, Sidney Gottlieb, the man running MKUltra, approached White with a proposition. The CIA needed to test its drugs and interrogation techniques on unwitting subjects. Not volunteers, not prisoners who had signed consent forms. Ordinary people who had no idea what was happening to them. The problem was operational security. If the CIA ran these experiments directly, the paper trail would lead back to Langley. But if they used a narcotics agent as a cutout, someone who already had a cover identity, who already operated in the underworld, who already knew how to find people who would not be missed, the deniability would be built into the architecture. White agreed. And so, in late 1953, the CIA rented an apartment at 81 Bedford Street in Greenwich Village, New York City. White moved in under the alias Morgan Hall. He told neighbors he was either a merchant seaman or a bohemian artist, depending on who was asking. The apartment was fitted with a one-way mirror. Behind that mirror, the CIA installed monitoring equipment, cameras, microphones, recording devices. And then White went to work. He recruited prostitutes. The arrangement was straightforward. The women would bring men back to the apartment. In exchange, they received $100 per man, a considerable sum in the 1950s, and something perhaps more valuable, chits. Get out of jail free cards, immunity from prosecution for their street work, courtesy of a narcotics agent with the authority to make arrests disappear. The men were served cocktails laced with LSD, and while the drugs took hold, while the walls began to move and the ceiling began to breathe and reality itself became unreliable, CIA agents sat on the other side of the mirror, watching, drinking their own cocktails and taking notes. Let me say that again, because the sentence deserves to be heard in full. The Central Intelligence Agency of the United States ran government-funded brothels, where prostitutes were paid with taxpayer money and legal immunity to lure men into drug experiments without their knowledge or consent, while intelligence officers observed through one-way mirrors, drinking martinis. That is not speculation. That is the declassified record. The New York operation ran for roughly 2 years, and then, in 1955, White was transferred to San Francisco. He opened a new safe house at 225 Chestnut Street in the Telegraph Hill neighborhood. This one was different. Where the New York apartment had been functional, the San Francisco safe house was theatrical. White furnished it in what the reports describe as French whorehouse style. Toulouse-Lautrec posters on the walls, photographs of women in bondage, the kind of decor designed to make visitors feel they had stumbled into something sophisticated and illicit, which of course they had. They simply did not know the nature of the illicit. The surveillance apparatus was more elaborate. 4 microphones disguised as electrical outlets, a two-way mirror, and behind the mirror, a control room equipped with a portable toilet for the long observation shifts, and a refrigerator stocked with martini fixings. The operation expanded, where the initial experiments had targeted what the agency euphemistically called marginal figures, men who frequented prostitutes, men whose complaints would carry little credibility. The scope gradually widened to include men of all sorts. The prostitutes were given additional instructions. After the drugs had taken hold, after the sexual encounter, they were to engage in what the agency called post-coital questioning, pillow talk, weaponized. The goal was to determine whether chemically altered subjects could be made to reveal secrets, respond to suggestion, or follow commands. They tested LSD. They tested mescaline. They tested marijuana. They tested combinations. They tested different dosages, different settings, different questioning techniques. They moved beyond the safe houses. CIA agents began dosing people in restaurants, in bars, on beaches. The experiments had left the laboratory, if they had ever been in one, and had simply become a way of operating. And at the center of it all, George Hunter White sat behind a one-way mirror in San Francisco, drinking martinis, watching strangers lose their grip on reality, and writing it all down. This went on for over a decade. It ended, not because anyone objected morally, and not because anyone was caught, but because, in 1963, CIA Inspector General John Ehrman conducted an internal review, and his finding was devastating. Not devastating because of the human cost, though the human cost was considerable. Devastating because after a decade of government-funded brothels, drug experiments, and wholesale violations of the constitutional rights of American citizens, the program had produced nothing useful. Ehrman's report included a line that deserves to be framed and hung in every intelligence agency on Earth. Quote, "As of 1960, no effective knockout pill, truth serum, aphrodisiac, or recruitment pill was known to exist. 10 years, thousands of unwitting subjects, an unknown number of lives disrupted, damaged, or destroyed, and the official conclusion was that none of it had worked. The safe houses were closed between 1963 and 1966. George Hunter White retired from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. No one was prosecuted. No one was disciplined. No one was named in a criminal complaint. But White left behind one document that tells you everything you need to know about Operation Midnight Climax and the era that produced it. In his farewell correspondence, the recipient is disputed, though most sources point to Gottlieb. White wrote, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" That letter is now preserved in White's papers at Stanford University. The San Francisco safe house at 225 Chestnut Street is today a private residence, valued at approximately $14.4 million. And if you are wondering what happened to the people who were drugged, manipulated, and violated in those rooms, the men who walked in expecting one evening and received something else entirely, the answer is the same answer you will hear in every file we open tonight. Nothing happened. Nothing happened because nothing was supposed to happen. The system was designed so that no one would be accountable, no one would be traceable, and no one would ever have to answer for what was done in those rooms. The CIA spent a decade running government-funded brothels. The official finding was that none of it worked, and the only person who ever described what it was actually like to be part of the operation called it fun, fun, fun. On March 13th, 1962, a document was placed on the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara at the Pentagon. The document was titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It was 15 pages long. It was authored by Brigadier General William H. Craig, with input from the Joint Chiefs Special Operations Department. And it had been approved by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At the bottom, the signature of the chairman, General Lyman L. Lemnitzer. This was not a rogue officer's fantasy scribbled on a napkin. This was the formal, institutional recommendation of the highest-ranking military body in the United States. The people in that room were not radicals. They were not fringe figures. They were the men entrusted with the defense of the nation, and they had submitted, through official channels with proper formatting and distribution markings, a plan to wage a covert war against the American people. Let me walk you through what they proposed. While American families were watching I Love Lucy in their living rooms, the Joint Chiefs were proposing a series of staged attacks on the United States Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay. The document specified: blow up ammunition inside the base, start fires, burn aircraft on the ground, lob mortar shells from outside the fence line, sabotage a ship in the harbor, sink a ship near the harbor entrance, and then, and this is in the document, conduct funerals for mock victims. Funerals for people who had not died, staged for the cameras. While families across America were planning their summer vacations, the Joint Chiefs were proposing a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami, in Washington, and in other American cities. The document reads, "We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba." It proposed exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots and the arrest of Cuban agents. Not real Cuban agents, fake ones, arrested on fake charges based on fake evidence to justify a real invasion. While John Glenn was orbiting the Earth in Friendship 7, while the nation watched a man circle the planet and held its breath, the Joint Chiefs had a contingency plan ready. If Glenn's rocket malfunctioned, if his capsule failed, if anything went wrong, they would blame Fidel Castro. The document called it Operation Dirty Trick. They proposed a deception involving a chartered civilian aircraft. The real plane would be loaded with passengers, all traveling under carefully prepared aliases, and then diverted to a military base where it would land secretly. Meanwhile, a drone aircraft, painted to match the original, would continue along the flight path, transmit a distress signal suggesting Cuban interference, and then be destroyed by remote signal over Cuban waters. Read that paragraph again. They proposed creating fictional passengers with fictional names, loading them onto a real airplane, secretly landing it at a military base, and then destroying a drone to make it look like Cuba had shot down a civilian flight. And perhaps the most chilling proposal of all, a Remember the Maine incident. The reference is to the 1898 explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which was used as a pretext for the Spanish-American War. The Joint Chiefs were explicitly proposing that the United States blow up one of its own Navy ships and then publish casualty lists, their words, in U.S. newspapers to create what the document called a helpful wave of national indignation. A helpful wave. These were not theoretical musings. This was a formal military recommendation with an implementation timeline, with specific tactical details, with distribution markings indicating it had been reviewed and approved at every level of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was the institutional will of the American military establishment, put on paper and handed to the Secretary of Defense. And this is where the story splits into two parallel tracks. On one track, the public record. President John F. Kennedy received the proposal, either directly or through McNamara, and rejected it. Kennedy reportedly said bluntly that we were not discussing the use of U.S. military force. Within months, General Lemnitzer was denied a second term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Kennedy replaced him with the more amenable General Maxwell Taylor. Kennedy killed the proposal. And then, in November of 1963, Kennedy himself was killed. And the document, the one proposing that America attack itself, vanished into the classified archives. On the other track, what did not happen? No investigation was opened into the Joint Chiefs' proposal. No officers were disciplined. No one was asked to explain how the most senior military leaders in the nation had unanimously endorsed a plan to commit acts of terrorism against their own citizens. Lemnitzer was not court-martialed. He was reassigned. He went on to serve as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe. The system absorbed the proposal, rejected it quietly, and moved on as if it had never existed. The document remained classified for 35 years. In 1997, the Assassination Records Review Board, a body created by Congress to release documents related to the Kennedy assassination, found the Northwoods file in the National Archives. It was declassified on November 18, 1997. It appeared online on November 6, 1998, through the National Security Archive at George Washington University. And almost no one noticed. The document was, in the words of one historian, almost universally ignored by the media. It was not until journalist James Bamford included it in his 2001 book, Body of Secrets, that it entered public awareness. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who had received the document on his desk in 1962, was asked about it decades later. His response? I have absolutely zero recollection of it, but I sure as hell would have rejected it. Zero recollection of a 13-page proposal signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs to stage terrorist attacks on American soil. The man who received it on his desk simply did not remember it existed. This is a pattern you will see again tonight. Not just the operations themselves, but the institutional amnesia that follows. The files vanish. The memories fade. The men who signed the documents develop convenient gaps in their recollection, and the system continues as if nothing happened, because, in a sense, nothing did happen. Northwoods was not carried out. No ships were sunk. No bombs went off in Miami. No funerals were staged for fictional casualties. But the document exists. It was written. It was signed. It was submitted through the chain of command. And the question it leaves behind is the one that makes it impossible to sleep comfortably tonight. This was the proposal they wrote down. This was the version that made it into the formal record. What proposals existed that were never committed to paper? What ideas were discussed in rooms where no one was taking notes? We do not know. We cannot know. Because the nature of secrecy is that we can only see what the system accidentally reveals, and that the gap between what is known and what is suspected, between what was proposed and what was done, is the space where every file on this desk tonight exists. On April 13th, 1953, CIA Director Alan Dulles authorized a program that would become the most extensive and most morally catastrophic experiment in the history of American intelligence. The program was called MKUltra. The MK prefix designated it as a project of the Technical Services Staff. The Ultra was a reference to the highest classification of World War II intelligence. It was, from its inception, designed to be invisible, and for 20 years it was. 149 sub-projects, 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, pharmaceutical companies, 185 researchers, most of whom had no idea they were working for the CIA. The funding was channeled through front organizations with names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the Geschichte Fund for Medical Research, the Human Ecology Fund. The researchers received grants. They published papers. They advanced their careers. They did not know, or chose not to know, that the money came from Langley. The stated purpose was defensive. The CIA believed that the Soviet Union and Communist China had developed techniques for brainwashing, for breaking down the human personality and rebuilding it according to the state's requirements. American prisoners in Korea had been returned in states that suggested psychological manipulation. The fear was that the enemy had cracked the code of the human mind, and the United States was behind. Whether or not this fear was justified, and the scientific consensus today is that it was dramatically overstated. It produced a blank check, and a blank check, given to an intelligence agency operating without oversight, will always be spent. At the center of MKUltra, from its first day to its last, was one man. His name was Sidney Gottlieb, but that was not the name he was born with. He was born Joseph Scheider in the Bronx, New York, in 1918, to Hungarian Jewish immigrant parents. He had a club foot, he had a severe stutter, and he had a mind that would prove to be among the most brilliant and most dangerous the American intelligence community ever produced. Gottlieb earned a chemistry doctorate from the California Institute of Technology. He was, by all accounts of his personal life, a man of contradictions so extreme that they seem impossible to contain within a single biography. He was a folk dancer. He raised goats on a farm in rural Virginia. He grew organic vegetables, decades before the concept entered mainstream culture. He practiced meditation. He volunteered with lepers in India during his retirement. He was also known within the CIA as the Black Sorcerer. For 20 years, he oversaw a program that dosed unwitting subjects with hallucinogenic drugs, subjected prisoners to extended sensory deprivation, administered massive electroshock treatments to psychiatric patients, and explored every conceivable method of breaking, bending, or erasing the human mind. The range of MKUltra's experiments defies summary, but the declassified records and the testimony of Admiral Stansfield Turner before the Senate in August of 1977 provide the framework. The program explored LSD and dozens of other psychoactive drugs, hypnosis, alone and in combination with drugs, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy at levels far exceeding any therapeutic protocol, verbal and sexual abuse as tools of psychological manipulation, radiation exposure, paralytics that simulated death, substances that could produce amnesia, confusion, euphoria, terror, or compliance. 44 colleges and universities were involved, 12 hospitals and clinics, 3 prisons. The scale was not a bug in the system. It was the design. Gottlieb understood that the only way to maintain secrecy across such a vast program was to ensure that no single researcher understood the whole picture. The compartmentalization was absolute. Each institution worked on its piece. Only Gottlieb saw the mosaic. And now we examine the chilling incident of Frank Olson. Deep Creek Lodge, Maryland. November 19th, 1953. A retreat for members of the CIA's Technical Services staff and their counterparts from the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick. Olson was there. So was Gottlieb. After dinner, Gottlieb produced a bottle of Cointreau. What the men at the table did not know was that the liqueur had been laced with LSD. Gottlieb waited 20 minutes and then told them what he had done. For most of the men, the effects were disorienting but temporary. For Olson, something broke. Over the following days, his behavior deteriorated rapidly. He became paranoid. He told his wife, Alice, that he had made a terrible mistake. He expressed a desire to leave the program. Instead of receiving medical care from an independent physician, Olson was taken to New York City and placed under the supervision of Dr. Harold Abramson, a physician who was himself under CIA contract, who specialized in allergies, not psychiatry, and who was receiving CIA funds for his own LSD experiments. 9 days after being dosed, on November the 28th, Frank Olson went through the closed window of room 1018A at the Hotel Statler. He fell 10 stories to the sidewalk below. He was 43 years old. The story the CIA told for 22 years was that Frank Olson had suffered a mental breakdown and committed suicide. His family was told nothing about the LSD, nothing about MKUltra, nothing about Gottlieb. It was not until 1975, when the Rockefeller Commission investigated CIA abuses, that the truth began to surface. The commission revealed that Olson had been an unwitting subject in a CIA drug experiment. President Gerald Ford personally apologized to the Olson family. Congress authorized a settlement of $750,000. But the family was not satisfied, and in 1994, they took a step that would change the story again. They had Frank Olson's body exhumed. Professor James Starrs of George Washington University assembled a forensic team. They conducted a new autopsy, 41 years after the death, and what they found was a cranial wound, a hematoma on the left side of the skull, an injury that had not been noted in the original autopsy. An injury that was, in Starrs's professional assessment, rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide. Olson had not merely fallen, he may have been struck on the head before going through that window. In 1996, the Manhattan District Attorney opened a homicide investigation. In 2012, the investigation was closed. Insufficient evidence. The hotel had been demolished decades earlier. The witnesses were dead, and the CIA, the agency that had drugged the man, placed him under surveillance, housed him with a handler, and reported his death as a suicide, maintained that it had no additional information to provide. 3 investigations, 3 different versions. And the truth of what happened in room 1018A at 2 in the morning remains as closed as the window Frank Olson went through. But MKUltra did not end with Frank Olson. It continued for another 20 years, and its reach extended far beyond the United States. In Montreal, Canada, at the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron was conducting experiments that remain among the most disturbing in the history of medicine. Cameron was not a fringe figure. He was the president of the American Psychiatric Association. He had testified at the Nuremberg trials. He was one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world, and he was receiving funding from the CIA, approximately $84,820 through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, to conduct what he called depatterning experiments. Patients came to the Allen Memorial Institute seeking treatment for depression, anxiety, and other common conditions. What they received was something else entirely. Cameron subjected his patients to electroshock therapy at levels 30 to 40 times the therapeutic standard. He placed them in drug-induced comas, lasting weeks, sometimes months. He forced them to listen to looped audio messages, sometimes a single phrase, repeated hundreds of thousands of times, through speakers installed in pillows from which they could not escape. The goal, as Cameron described it, was to erase the existing personality, to reduce the patient to a blank state, and then rebuild it from scratch. What happened in practice was that patients were reduced to childlike states. They lost the ability to recognize their own families. They lost bladder control. They lost years of memory. Some never recovered. The Canadian government also funded Cameron's work, providing over $500,000. In 1992, 77 victims received compensation from the Canadian government. In 2022, a class action lawsuit by approximately 55 families was authorized. As recently as July 2025, a Quebec Superior Court authorized a class action against the Royal Victoria Hospital, McGill University, and the Government of Canada. The patients in Montreal did not volunteer for what was done to them. They came seeking help, and the institution that was supposed to help them, funded in part by the intelligence agency of a foreign government, used them as raw material for experiments in personality destruction. By the early 1970s, MKUltra had become a liability. The political climate had shifted. The Watergate scandal had made the public and Congress far less willing to accept intelligence agencies operating without oversight. And in January of 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision. He ordered the destruction of the MKUltra files. Sidney Gottlieb personally supervised the shredding. Approximately 80% of all MKUltra records were destroyed, but not all of them. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request by journalist John Marks led to the discovery of 7 boxes of MKUltra documents, roughly 20,000 pages, that had survived. They had survived not because anyone intended to preserve them, but because of a bureaucratic accident. The documents were financial records, budgets, expense reports, funding requests that had been filed in a separate building under budgetary titles and sent to the Retired Records Center in 1970. When Gottlieb supervised the destruction, these boxes were not in the building. They were in a different filing system, under different headings, in a different physical location. A filing error saved the record. Those 20,000 pages became the foundation of the 1977 Senate hearings. Admiral Stansfield Turner, the Director of Central Intelligence, testified before Senator Daniel Inouye's committee on August 3, 1977. He confirmed the scope: 149 sub-projects, 80 institutions, 185 researchers, 14 sub-projects definitely involving human testing, 6 involving subjects who did not know they were being tested. Turner did not offer an apology. He offered an accounting, partial, incomplete, based on the 20% that survived Gottlieb's shredder. And then there is the final irony of MKUltra, perhaps the cruelest one. The program's unwitting subjects included people who would go on to shape the very counterculture that the American government spent the 1960s trying to suppress. Whitey Bulger, the future mob boss, was given LSD daily for over a year at a federal penitentiary as part of what he was told was a study on curing schizophrenia. Ken Kesey received LSD through an MKUltra-sponsored experiment at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital and went on to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and launch The Merry Pranksters. Robert Hunter, the lyricist of the Grateful Dead, participated in MKUltra drug experiments at Stanford. Allen Ginsberg's first LSD experience came through the same pipeline. The CIA's program to control the human mind inadvertently helped launch the psychedelic revolution. The counterculture, the movement that challenged the establishment, questioned authority, and rejected the Cold War consensus, was in part an unintended product of the establishment's own experiments. The blowback principle, the cure that creates the disease. You will see this pattern in nearly every file on my desk tonight. In 1976, President Gerald Ford issued the first executive order on intelligence activities, prohibiting drug experimentation on human subjects without informed written consent. Sidney Gottlieb retired. He spent his final years raising goats, meditating, and volunteering with lepers in India. He died in 1999 at the age of 80. He was never charged with a crime. And as of December 2024, the National Security Archive and ProQuest published a new scholarly collection of over 1,200 essential MKUltra records. A reminder that the story is not finished, that the files continue to surface, that the full scope of what was done under the authority of the United States government, in the name of national security, During a program that lasted 20 years and touched 80 institutions and hundreds of unwitting human subjects, that scope is still being measured. The file is thick, the margins are full, and even now, more than 50 years after Gottlieb fed the records into the shredder, the paper keeps surfacing. It always does. I am going to tell you about a cat, not a metaphorical cat, not a code name that sounds like a cat. An actual, living, domestic cat that the Central Intelligence Agency spent 5 years and approximately $20 million attempting to turn into a surveillance device. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. $20 million. 5 years. A cat. The year was 1962. The Cold War was at its peak. The Cuban Missile Crisis would bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation before the year was out. The Berlin Wall had been standing for a little over a year. Soviet and American intelligence agencies were locked in a shadow war that spanned every continent, every discipline, and, as it turned out, every species. The problem, as the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology understood it, was straightforward. Soviet diplomats had meetings. Those meetings took place in parks, on benches, in outdoor spaces where traditional listening devices could not easily be planted. The agency needed something that could approach a target without arousing suspicion. Something that could sit near a conversation and transmit audio back to a listening post. Something that belonged in a park. Something no one would think twice about. Someone, somewhere, in the Office of Research and Development, looked at this problem and said, "What about a cat?" And instead of being laughed out of the room, instead of someone saying, "That is the most absurd idea I have heard in my career, and I work for an agency that runs government-funded brothels," the idea was approved, funded, staffed, and pursued for half a decade with the same institutional seriousness that the agency brought to overthrowing governments. The surgical procedure took approximately an hour. A veterinary surgeon opened the cat and implanted, in sequence, a microphone in the ear canal, a radio transmitter, 3/4 of an inch long, embedded at the base of the skull, batteries placed inside the rib cage, and an antenna made from fine wire threaded through the cat's fur from the back of its skull all the way down to the tip of its tail. The tail was the antenna. They also implanted wires in the cat's brain. The purpose of these wires was to override the cat's natural urges, specifically hunger and the desire to mate, so that it would remain focused on its mission rather than wandering off to find food or companionship. Let me underscore what has just been described. The Central Intelligence Agency surgically modified a living animal, implanting electronic equipment throughout its body, threading wire through its fur, and installing electrodes in its brain to suppress its natural instincts, so that it could eavesdrop on Soviet diplomats sitting on a park bench. Victor Marchetti, a former CIA officer who later became one of the agency's most prominent critics, described the result in terms that are difficult to improve upon. "They slit the cat open," Marchetti said, "put batteries in him, wired him up. The tail was used as an antenna. They made a monstrosity." The technical challenges were, in retrospect, exactly what you would expect when you try to turn a living creature into a radio transmitter. The early prototypes had a microphone sensitivity problem. The microphone was in the cat's ear canal. The cat had a heartbeat. The cat had a digestive system. The heartbeat and the stomach gurgles were louder in the microphone's pickup range than ambient human conversation. The CIA had successfully built a listening device that could hear the cat's own stomach better than it could hear a Soviet diplomat discussing classified information 3 feet away. The transmitters overheated. Inside a living body, where the ambient temperature is roughly 100 degrees Fahrenheit, electronic components that were already miniaturized to their physical limits generated heat that had nowhere to go. The transmission range was poor. The battery life was extremely limited, and all of the equipment had to be completely invisible. No external protrusions, no visible scars, nothing that would cause a bystander to look at this cat and think anything other than, that is a cat. 5 years, $20 million, and an unknown number of cats. By approximately 1967, the CIA was ready for a field test. The first, and as it turned out, the only, operational deployment of Acoustic Kitty. The target was straightforward. 2 men sitting on a park bench near the Soviet Embassy compound on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C. CIA personnel set up in an unmarked van nearby, surrounded by receiving equipment, monitoring dials, and whatever hopeful optimism had survived 5 years of development. The cat was released from the van, and this is where the story fractures into 2 versions. Because the CIA, an organization that spent $20 million building a cat-based surveillance system, cannot agree on what happened next. According to Victor Marchetti, who told the story in multiple interviews over the years, the cat was released from the van, walked toward the target, and was immediately struck and killed by a taxi. They put him out of the van, Marchetti recounted, and a taxi comes and runs him over. There they were, sitting in the van, with all those dials, and the cat was dead. $20 million. 5 years of surgery and engineering. A team of scientists, veterinarians, and intelligence officers. And a taxi. But in 2013, Robert Wallace, a former head of the CIA's Office of Technical Services, offered a different version. Wallace claimed that the Acoustic Kitty was not killed by getting run over by a taxicab. He stated that the cat was recovered after the test, the equipment was surgically removed, and the cat lived a long and happy life afterwards. The CIA cannot agree on whether its own spy cat was killed by a taxi or retired to a comfortable domestic life. Both versions come from credible former CIA officials. Neither has been definitively confirmed by declassified records. The truth of what happened to Acoustic Kitty on Wisconsin Avenue remains classified, or more likely, was never written down in the first place. What is written down is the final assessment. The declassified CIA memo, document identification number 21897, dated March 1967, titled Views on Trained Cats, followed by redacted portions, concluded that the project represented a remarkable scientific achievement. The memo also concluded that, quote, for our intelligence purposes, it would not be practical. A remarkable scientific achievement that was not practical. That sentence is the epitaph of Acoustic Kitty. And, in many ways, it is the epitaph of an entire era of intelligence work. Brilliant people, vast budgets, and ideas so detached from operational reality that they could only have been conceived in institutions where no one had the authority or the inclination to say no. There is one more detail about Acoustic Kitty that deserves mention, though it must be offered with appropriate caution. Some accounts suggest that the miniaturized batteries developed for the program, batteries designed to survive long-term inside a living body, at body temperature, without leaking or degrading, contributed to breakthroughs in battery chemistry for implantable cardiac pacemakers. If true, it would mean that the CIA's $20 million spy cat inadvertently helped save millions of human lives. The historical evidence for this connection is suggestive rather than definitive. But the possibility itself is worth noting because it captures something essential about the Cold War. Even the most absurd expenditures sometimes produced unintended benefits that no one had planned for and no one could have predicted. And Acoustic Kitty was not alone. The CIA's interest in animal-based espionage extended well beyond a single cat. The agency ran Operation Takana, which fitted pigeons with miniature cameras. It developed Project Aquiline, a bird-shaped drone built by McDonnell Douglas. It created the Insectothopter, a robotic dragonfly designed to function as a flying listening device. It built a robotic catfish called Charlie for underwater surveillance, and it trained ravens to drop bugging devices on windowsills. The CIA turned a remarkable number of animals into intelligence assets. The animals, for their part, remained stubbornly uncooperative. On September 16, 1975, Senator Frank Church of Idaho held up a weapon on live television. The hearing room was packed, the cameras were rolling, and Church, a senator who had spent the previous year leading the most sweeping investigation into intelligence agency abuses in American history, was holding a modified Colt 1911 pistol that the CIA had designed to kill people in a way that would look like natural causes. The photograph of that moment, Church at the committee table, arm extended, the weapon displayed for the camera, became one of the most iconic images of the 1970s. Not because of the gun itself, though the gun was remarkable, but because of what the image represented, the first time the American public saw, with its own eyes, the physical machinery of state-sponsored assassination. The weapon was a product of MKNAOMI. MKNAOMI was the Joint CIA Army Biological Weapons Program, administered through the Special Operations Command at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the same facility where Frank Olson had worked before his death in 1953. The program began in 1952. Its annual budget started at $200,000, peaked at $390,000 in 1958, and totaled an estimated $3 million over its lifetime. The program developed an arsenal of biological and chemical weapons designed for covert use. Toxins that could be introduced into food or water supplies, substances that could cause diseases mimicking natural illness, delivery systems that could be concealed in everyday objects. And then there was the gun. The modified Colt 1911 had been adapted to fire a frozen dart made of shellfish toxin, saxitoxin, one of the most potent natural poisons known to science. The dart was engineered with a precision that bordered on the elegant. It could penetrate clothing. Upon entering the body, It left only a tiny red dot on the skin, a mark so small that a medical examiner would almost certainly miss it. The dart itself dissolved almost immediately after penetrating the body. The toxin it carried caused cardiac arrest that mimicked a natural heart attack, and standard autopsy procedures of the era would not detect the poison. A weapon that killed without leaving evidence. A heart attack that was not a heart attack. A murder that looked like nature taking its course. This is what Senator Church held up for the cameras on September 16th, 1975. But the weapon was only part of the story. The larger scandal, the one that produced the most revealing testimony of the entire Church Committee investigation, concerned what happened when the program was supposed to end. In November of 1969, President Richard Nixon issued a formal directive banning biological weapons. The United States would no longer develop, produce, or stockpile biological agents for offensive use. All existing stockpiles were to be destroyed. The order was clear. It was presidential. It was public. CIA Director Richard Helms transmitted the order to the relevant divisions. Destroy the stockpile. Sidney Gottlieb, the same man who ran MKUltra, the same man who dosed Frank Olson, the same man who would later supervise the destruction of 80% of the MKUltra files, conveyed the order to the CIA chemist responsible for the agency's biological materials. A man named Nathan Gordon. The President of the United States said, "Destroy them." The Director of the CIA said, "Destroy them." Gottlieb said, "Destroy them." Nathan Gordon did not destroy them. According to Gordon's later testimony, he simply could not bring himself to do it. The shellfish toxin was extraordinarily difficult to produce. Roughly 100 pounds of shellfish yielded a single gram of pure toxin. The production process was laborious, expensive, and not easily repeated. Gordon, who had spent years working with these materials, who understood their rarity, who appreciated the scientific achievement they represented, made a decision. He disobeyed a presidential order, a directive from the CIA director, and a direct instruction from his immediate superior. He kept the poisons. When the Church Committee investigated in 1975, 6 years after Nixon's order, they discovered that the CIA still possessed approximately 11 grams of shellfish toxin, enough to kill roughly 5,500 people. They also found cobra venom, strychnine, cyanide pills, and 19 other lethal substances, all of which should have been destroyed. All of which had been quietly preserved by a single man who, in his own words, simply couldn't bear to see the stuff destroyed. CIA Director William Colby, who had to explain this to the committee, offered a defense that captured the institutional culture more precisely than any academic analysis could. The materials were kept, Colby said, because the people responsible for them were so completely enmeshed in the subject and the difficulty of production that they simply couldn't bear to see the stuff destroyed. They could not bear it. A presidential order to destroy weapons of assassination was overridden, not by a conspiracy, not by a rogue operation, not by a hostile foreign power, but by a man's personal attachment to his work. The institutional inertia was more powerful than a direct command from the President of the United States. And that is perhaps the most disturbing revelation of the MKNAOMI file. Not the weapon itself, though the weapon is disturbing. Not the toxin stockpile, though the stockpile is disturbing. But the demonstration that within the intelligence community, institutional culture could override presidential authority, and the man who chose to do so faced no consequences. Nathan Gordon was not prosecuted. He was not disciplined. He was not even reprimanded. He disobeyed a presidential order, retained enough poison to kill thousands of people, and the system simply absorbed the transgression and moved on. There is one more chapter to the MKNAOMI story. On October 7th, 1975, 3 weeks after Church held up the heart attack gun, Sidney Gottlieb appeared before the committee. He did not appear as Sidney Gottlieb. He testified under his birth name, Joseph Scheider. He was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for 40 hours of testimony spread across multiple sessions. And his testimony, by all accounts, was a masterclass in the institutional amnesia that characterized the entire era. Gottlieb claimed very little recollection of specifics. The man who had managed MKUltra for 20 years, who had personally supervised the destruction of 80% of its records, who had overseen the development of assassination weapons, drug experiments, and the full apparatus of chemical and biological covert action, that man, under oath, could not remember the details. Those 40 hours of testimony were sealed for 50 years. The transcripts were released in October of 2025 by the National Security Archive, half a century after they were recorded. And even now, the full picture of what Gottlieb knew, what he ordered, and what he chose to forget remains incomplete. The heart attack gun now exists primarily as a photograph. Senator Church, arm extended, weapon displayed. A single frozen moment that captured something larger. The instant when the machinery of secret power was held up to the light, examined, and then, slowly, quietly, with the infinite patience of an institution that knows it will outlast any investigation, folded back into the classified files. There is a question that hangs over Project Stargate like a fog, and it is this. Either the United States government was fooled for 23 years by parlor tricks, or remote viewing actually works. Either answer is profoundly disturbing. The program went by many names over its 2-decade lifespan. Scanate, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and finally, Stargate, the name under which it was eventually declassified and by which it is remembered. But the core proposition never changed. The Central Intelligence Agency, along with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Army, and various other branches of the national security establishment, funded, trained, and operationally deployed people who claimed to perceive distant locations, objects, and events using nothing but their minds. Psychic spies. That is not hyperbole. That is the declassified description. The program began in 1972 at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, the same stretch of Silicon Valley that would later produce Apple, Google, and Facebook. The initial motivation was, as with so many Cold War intelligence programs, the fear that the Soviets were doing it first. By 1970, reports had reached the CIA that the Soviet Union was investing substantial resources in what it called psychotronic research, the study of psychic phenomena for potential military and intelligence applications. A 1970 book titled Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain catalyzed the agency's concern. The estimates were alarming. By the mid-1970s, The Soviets were allegedly spending over 300 million rubles per year on this research. Whether or not those estimates were accurate, and there is considerable reason to doubt them, the CIA's logic was familiar. If the Soviets have it, we need it. If the Soviets might have it, we need to find out. And if finding out requires spending $20 million over 23 years on psychic research, then that is what the budget is for. The initial pilot study cost $49,909, an 8-month biofield measurements program. The second year expanded to $149,555, and it grew from there, year after year, through multiple administrations, multiple intelligence directors, and multiple name changes, until the total expenditure reached $19.993 million. The program was administered by two physicists, Dr. Harold Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. They are the ones who coined the term remote viewing, the idea that a trained individual, given only geographic coordinates or a sealed envelope containing a target description, could perceive and describe distant locations with no physical access to them. The first subject tested at SRI was Ingo Swann, an artist and self-described psychic whose initial results were sufficiently intriguing to convince the CIA to proceed with a full-scale program. But the most prominent figure in Stargate's history, and the one whose story is most difficult to dismiss, is Joseph McMoneagle. McMoneagle was designated Remote Viewer Number 1. He was a retired Army Chief Warrant Officer, first recruited into the program in 1978. And the story he tells about the Typhoon submarine is the one that makes skeptics uncomfortable. In 1979, McMoneagle claimed that he remote-viewed a large warehouse-like structure near the White Sea in northern Russia. He described something unusual inside it, a submarine of unprecedented size, with slanted missile tubes and a unique double-hull structure. Nothing like it existed in any known Soviet naval inventory. The United States Navy dismissed his description. No such submarine was known to be in development. McMoneagle's report was filed and, presumably, forgotten. And then satellite imagery confirmed it. The Soviet Union was building the Typhoon-class submarine, the largest submarine ever constructed, 574 feet long, 48,000 tons submerged displacement, with design features that matched McMoneagle's description in ways that should have been impossible for a man sitting in a room at Stanford Research Institute with no access to classified intelligence. McMoneagle's other claimed achievements include describing the interior of a top-secret Soviet manufacturing plant, sketching the location of a U.S. Army general held hostage by the Red Brigades in Italy, predicting when the Skylab space station would leave orbit 11 months before the actual event, and locating a downed Soviet bomber carrying nuclear materials. Upon his retirement in 1984, McMoneagle received the Legion of Merit, one of the highest decorations the military can bestow for non-combat service. His citation states that he served in a unique intelligence project that is revolutionizing the intelligence community and produced critical intelligence unavailable from any other source. The citation specifies that his work was utilized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the CIA, and the Secret Service. The Legion of Merit is not given to charlatans. It is not given as a joke. It is a formal military decoration with specific criteria, and it was awarded to a man whose primary contribution to national security was sitting in a room and describing what he saw with his eyes closed. And yet, in 1988, the National Research Council published an evaluation that concluded there should remain little doubt that the TARG put-off studies are fatally flawed. Researchers Mark and Kamen attempted to replicate the SRI results and found that session order clues in the experimental materials could explain the reported hit rates. The findings were published in Nature and the proceedings of the IEE, but the broader scientific community regarded the entire enterprise as pseudoscience. In 1995, the CIA commissioned the American Institutes for Research to conduct a final evaluation. 2 evaluators were assigned. Jessica Utz, a statistician, analyzed the data and found statistically significant results. Ray Hyman, a psychologist and noted skeptic, analyzed the same data and found methodological problems that undermined the conclusions. The AIR's final assessment was that the program had no demonstrated operational value. Project Stargate was terminated in November of 1995. The records were declassified in July of that year. 23 years. Nearly $20 million. Hundreds of remote viewing sessions conducted for the highest levels of the American intelligence and military establishment. A Legion of Merit awarded for psychic espionage. And at the end of it all, the evaluators could not agree on whether it worked. Here is what I find most interesting about Project Stargate. Not the question of whether remote viewing is real. That is a question for scientists, and the scientific consensus is reasonably clear. What interests me is what the program reveals about institutions. For 23 years, across multiple administrations, through Republican and Democratic presidencies, through directors of Central Intelligence who prided themselves on hard-headed realism, through an intelligence community that staked its reputation on evidence-based analysis, for all of that time, the United States government continued to fund psychic research. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the possibility was too tantalizing to abandon. Because the Cold War fear machine could not afford to leave any potential advantage unexplored. Because shutting down the program meant admitting that it should never have been started. And because, in the quiet, bureaucratic corners where budgets are renewed and programs are continued by default, it is always easier to fund another year than to explain why you are stopping. The Cold War did not just create weapons, it created a permission structure, a framework in which almost anything could be justified, almost any expenditure approved, almost any idea pursued, as long as someone could argue that the Soviets might be doing it too. Project Stargate cost the American taxpayer $20 million. Whether it produced genuine intelligence or elaborate self-deception depends entirely on whom you ask. But the fact that it existed at all, that the most powerful intelligence apparatus in human history spent a generation paying psychics to spy on the Soviet Union, tells you something about the nature of power that no remote viewer could have predicted. When you are afraid enough, and rich enough, and accountable to no one, you will try anything, even psychics, even for 23 years. In 1951, Iran was a democracy. That sentence surprises most people. The Iran that dominates today's headlines. The Iran of the Islamic Republic, of the Ayatollahs, of the Revolutionary Guard and the nuclear program, and the chance of death to America. That Iran did not yet exist. In 1951, Iran had a parliament. It had elections. It had a prime minister who had been chosen through a democratic process. And that prime minister, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, had just done something that terrified the most powerful nations on earth. He had nationalized the oil. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand the arrangement it replaced. Since 1913, Iran's oil had been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, which would later rebrand itself as a company you know today, British Petroleum, BP. The terms of the arrangement were, by any reasonable standard, exploitative. AIOC paid Iran 16% of net profits, 16%, for the right to extract, refine, and sell the most valuable natural resource beneath Iranian soil. Meanwhile, in Saudi Arabia, the American Oil Consortium, Aramco, had negotiated a 50-50 split with the Saudi government. The Saudis received 50%, the Iranians received 16%. When Mossadegh and the Iranian parliament moved to nationalize the oil industry, when they voted unanimously on March 15, 1951, to take control of their own resources, it was not an act of radicalism, it was an act of arithmetic. They were simply demanding what other oil-producing nations had already secured. Britain did not see it that way. The British government viewed nationalization as theft, and their response was swift: an international embargo on Iranian oil. British warships blockaded Iranian ports. The message was clear. If Iran would not accept British terms, Iran would not sell oil to anyone. The embargo devastated the Iranian economy. Mossadegh appealed to the United States for help. At first, under President Truman, the Americans were sympathetic, or at least neutral. Truman saw Mossadegh as a legitimate nationalist leader, not a communist threat. But in January of 1953, Dwight Eisenhower took office, and the British, who had been lobbying Washington for months, found a receptive audience. Their argument was simple and effective. Mossadegh's government was weakening. If it fell, the communists, specifically the Tudeh Party, which had Soviet backing, would fill the vacuum. Iran would become a Soviet satellite. The oil would be lost. The Middle East would tip. It was a Cold War argument. And in 1953, Cold War arguments won. The CIA designated the operation TPAJAX. The British called it Operation Boot. The man chosen to lead the American side was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, cousin of President Franklin Roosevelt, and a CIA officer with a taste for adventure that matched his pedigree. Roosevelt entered Iran with a small team and a large budget. His mission? Overthrow a democratically elected government and replace it with one more amenable to Western oil interests. The first attempt failed. On August 15, 1953, Colonel Nematollah Nasiri was dispatched to Mossadegh's residence, carrying a royal decree, a firman, from the Shah, dismissing the prime minister. But Mossadegh had been warned. Instead of accepting the decree, Mossadegh had Nasiri arrested. The plan had been exposed before it could be executed. The Shah, who had reluctantly agreed to participate in the coup, panicked. He fled the country, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. The operation appeared to be over. CIA headquarters sent Roosevelt a cable. Abort. Come home. The mission has failed. Roosevelt refused. He decided, on his own authority, without clearance from Washington, to try again. 4 days later, on August 19th, Roosevelt's second attempt succeeded. He organized paid demonstrators. He recruited gang leaders and strongmen from Tehran's bazaars. He brought men into the city in buses and trucks. He paid them to march, to shout, to create the appearance of a popular uprising against Mossadegh. Genuine royalists and citizens who were genuinely dissatisfied with the economic crisis, a crisis caused in large part by the British embargo, merged with the paid agitators, creating a mass of bodies that appeared spontaneous, but was, in its core, manufactured. Street fighting erupted. An estimated 200 to 300 people were killed, though precise numbers are impossible to establish. Military units, including tanks, moved toward Mossadegh's residence. Mossadegh escaped over a back wall, but was arrested the following day. General Fazlollah Zahedi, the man the CIA had selected, was installed as the new prime minister. The Shah returned triumphantly on August 22nd. A democracy had been overthrown, a monarch had been restored, and the oil was secured. Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement, his death sentence commuted by the Shah, perhaps out of some residual sense of political calculation. After his imprisonment, he was placed under house arrest, where he remained until his death on March 5, 1967. He never held public office again. The spoils were divided. The Shah signed over 40% of Iran's oil fields to American companies. AIOC, now rebranded as British Petroleum, retained 40%. Dutch and French companies received the remaining 20%. The nationalization that had prompted the crisis was reversed. The oil flowed again, and the arrangement that replaced it was more favorable to Western interests than the one Mossadegh had tried to dismantle. Mission accomplished. Except that in geopolitics, there is no such thing as an ending. There are only consequences. The first consequence came in 1957, when the Shah established Savak, Iran's secret police, with training provided by the CIA and the Israeli Mossad. Savak employed between 5,000 and 6,000 agents, plus an unknown number of informers. Its documented methods included electric shock, whipping, and prolonged beating. Over 4,000 Tudeh Party activists were arrested. 40 were executed. At least 14 died under torture. Savak did not exist in a vacuum. It existed because the Shah, a monarch restored to power by a foreign intelligence agency, a man who knew that his legitimacy was manufactured, needed an apparatus of control. The CIA provided the training. The consequences were borne by the Iranian people. The second consequence came in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic. The revolution was, in significant part, a response to the decades of repression that followed the 1953 coup. Savak had destroyed Iran's moderate secular political center. The educated middle class had been silenced, imprisoned, or driven into exile. What remained were two forces: radical Islamists and radical leftists. When the revolution came, the Islamists won. The third consequence came on November 4th, 1979, when Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. The students' primary fear, stated explicitly at the time, was that the United States would stage another 1953-style coup to restore the Shah. Among their demands was a formal apology from the American government for the overthrow of Mossadegh. The blowback chain. 1953 coup, Savak. Revolution. Hostage crisis. 40-plus years of hostility between two nations that, in a different timeline, a timeline without Ajax, without Operation Boot, without Kermit Roosevelt and his paid demonstrators, might have been allies. The admissions came slowly. In 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright acknowledged American involvement in the coup. In 2009, President Barack Obama, speaking in Cairo, said, "In the middle of the Cold War, the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government." In 2013, the CIA formally acknowledged its role through declassified documents. In 2017, the State Department released approximately 1,000 pages of previously classified records. And in 2023, the CIA described the coup as undemocratic, the first time the agency had used that word. 70 years. That is how long it took for the institution that carried out the coup to describe it as what it was. And the consequences have not ended. They will not end, because the blowback principle does not have a statute of limitation. The 1953 coup did not solve a problem. It created a cascade of problems that has outlasted every person who planned the operation, every official who approved it, and every agent who carried it out. Kermit Roosevelt wrote a book about it. He called it counter-coup. He seemed proud. The Iranians have never forgotten. That is the nature of geopolitical chess. You can take the king, but the game does not end when the board is cleared. The game ends when the consequences run out, and they never do. The Iran-Contra affair is not one scandal. It is two scandals, bolted together by a Marine lieutenant colonel with a shredder and a gift for improvisation. The first scandal: the United States of America secretly sold weapons to Iran, a nation under an American arms embargo, a nation that had held American citizens hostage for 444 days, a nation that the Reagan administration publicly denounced as a state sponsor of terrorism, in exchange for the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, an organization funded and directed by Iran. The second scandal: the profits from those illegal arms sales, approximately $16 to $18 million, were secretly diverted to fund the Contras, a rebel army fighting the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua, despite the fact that Congress had explicitly and unambiguously prohibited the United States government from providing that funding. The Boland Amendment, passed between 1982 and 1984, could not have been clearer. No funds available to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or any other agency involved in intelligence activities could be used to support military operations in Nicaragua. The law was not ambiguous. It was not open to interpretation. It was a direct prohibition, passed by the elected representatives of the American people, signed into law, and binding on every branch of the executive. And it was ignored. At the center of the operation, the man who built the machinery, ran the logistics, and fed the documents into the shredder when it all fell apart, was Oliver North. North was a Marine lieutenant colonel assigned to the National Security Council staff. He was not a policymaker. He was not a cabinet member. He was not even a particularly senior official. But he was energetic, he was resourceful, and he had the backing of his superiors. National Security Advisor John Poindexter, and before him, Robert McFarlane. And behind all of them, at a distance that was either strategic or coincidental, depending on whom you believe, stood CIA Director William Casey. North built what he called the Enterprise, a private, off-the-books network of shell companies, Swiss bank accounts, arms dealers, and intermediaries that existed for one purpose: to do what Congress had forbidden the government to do. The Arms for Hostages scheme delivered over 1,500 TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk surface-to-air missiles to Iran. In return, 3 of 7 American hostages held in Lebanon were eventually released. 3 new hostages were taken during the same period. The net gain was negative. The United States had sold weapons to a hostile nation, violated its own embargo, and ended up with more hostages than it started with. The profits from those sales, money that existed in a shadow economy with no congressional oversight and no legal authorization, were diverted to the Contras in Nicaragua. And the logistics chain for that diversion ran through some of the most compromised intermediaries imaginable. The Kerry Committee, a Senate Foreign Relations subcommittee chaired by Senator John Kerry, investigated the drug connection and found something that the American public has never fully absorbed. Setco Air, the principal company used by the Contras in Honduras to transport military supplies, was owned by Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, a Honduran drug trafficker linked to the Medellin cartel. Setco carried, according to the Kerry Committee's findings, at least 1 million rounds of ammunition, food, uniforms, and other military supplies for the Contras from 1983 through 1985. The State Department paid Setco $185,924.25 between January and August of 1986. That is a precise number. It appears in the official documentation. The United States government paid a company owned by a drug trafficker linked to a cocaine cartel to transport weapons to a rebel army that Congress had prohibited the government from supporting. Mata Ballesteros was later implicated in the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, one of the most notorious killings of a federal agent in American history. The Kerry Committee's conclusion was unequivocal. There was substantial evidence of drug smuggling through the war zones on the part of individual Contras, Contra suppliers, Contra pilots, mercenaries who worked with the Contras, and Contra supporters. The drugs flowed north, the weapons flowed south, and in the middle, a Marine lieutenant colonel at the White House managed the traffic. On November 3, 1986, a Lebanese magazine called Ash-Shirar broke the story of the arms sales to Iran. Within weeks, the entire apparatus began to unravel, and on November 21st, Oliver North did what cornered men in Washington have always done. He shredded the evidence. For 4 days, November 21st through November 25th, 1986, North fed documents into a shredder at the old Executive Office building, page after page, hour after hour. The record of the enterprise, the arms shipments, the financial transfers, the communications with intermediaries, all of it going into the machine. And when the shredder jammed, because shredders do jam, especially when you are feeding them 4 days' worth of classified documents in a state of barely controlled panic. North's secretary, Fawn Hall, stepped in. Hall smuggled documents out of the White House, in her boots, under her clothing. She later testified that she had also altered and removed NSC documents. She was 27 years old. She was a secretary. and she was helping a Marine lieutenant colonel destroy evidence of crimes committed at the highest levels of the American government. The investigations that followed were extensive. The Tower Commission, appointed by President Reagan himself, reported in February of 1987 that the president bore ultimate responsibility for the affair. The Joint Congressional Committee held hearings at which North testified in his Marine uniform and, briefly, became a folk hero to a segment of the American public that admired his apparent loyalty and willingness to fall on his sword. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh spent 6 years investigating. 14 people were indicted, 9 government officers and 5 private citizens. 11 were convicted, though 2 of those convictions were later vacated on appeal because the testimony used against the defendants had been given under a grant of congressional immunity. But the final chapter of Iran-Contra was written not by a court, but by a president. On December 24, 1992, Christmas Eve, President George H.W. Bush pardoned 6 Iran-Contra defendants. Among them was former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, whose trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. Weinberger's case was particularly sensitive because his personal diary entries contained evidence that contradicted the accounts given by senior administration officials, including, potentially, Bush himself. Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel who had spent 6 years building the case, was not subtle in his assessment. He called the pardons the last card in a cover-up. He noted that Bush himself was a subject of the investigation. Bush had been vice president during the affair, and his precise level of knowledge was a matter of active dispute. Walsh wrote in his diary that the pardons represented a final act to prevent full disclosure. Christmas Eve, 6 pardons, a trial that would never happen, a cover-up that would never be fully penetrated. The pattern is familiar. You have seen it in every file on this desk tonight. The operation is carried out, the laws are broken, the evidence is destroyed, the investigations are launched. And then, at the final moment, the system protects itself. Not through conspiracy, not through coordinated silence, but through the simple structural fact that the people who have the power to investigate are also the people who have the power to pardon. And the pardoning power, unlike the investigative power, has no appeal. Oliver North's convictions were vacated. He went on to become a conservative media figure and, briefly, the president of the National Rifle Association. Fawn Hall became a footnote. William Casey, the CIA director who may have been the architect of the entire scheme, died in May of 1987 before he could be fully questioned, taking whatever he knew to his grave. Ronald Reagan said he did not remember authorizing arms for hostages. The Tower Commission found that he did not seem to be aware of the diversion. And the word aware has been doing a remarkable amount of work in that sentence for nearly 40 years. I want to be precise about what is known and what is alleged, because this file is one where the line between the two matters more than in any other. The name Operation Mockingbird, as applied to a broad CIA media manipulation program, comes primarily from author Deborah Davis, who used it in her 1979 book about Katharine Graham and the Washington Post. The CIA's own Family Jewels documents, the internal accounting of agency abuses compiled in 1973, do reference a Project Mockingbird, but that was a specific 1963 wiretapping operation targeting 2 American journalists. It was not the name of a broad media influence program. This distinction matters because precision matters, and the temptation, with a story this large, is to collapse the specific into the general, to use one code name as a container for everything the CIA did in relation to the American and global press. So, let me set the code name aside and tell you what is confirmed, what the Church Committee found, what the declassified record establishes, what the CIA itself, in some cases, has acknowledged on its own website. In 1975, the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, investigated the CIA's relationship with the American media. Their findings were published the following year. Approximately 50 American journalists had official covert relationships with the Central Intelligence Agency, not informal contacts, not sources who occasionally shared information over drinks. Official, compensated, covert relationships in which journalists performed tasks for the agency as part of a structured arrangement. Approximately 25 American news organizations provided cover for CIA operatives. This means that people identifying themselves as reporters, editors, or correspondents for these organizations were, in fact, intelligence officers using the press credential as a disguise. Beyond the American press, the CIA maintained a network of what the committee described as several hundred foreign individuals who provided intelligence and influenced opinion in their respective countries. The CIA had direct access to, and the committee used this phrase carefully, a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers. And here is the detail that elevates this from troubling to alarming. The CIA refused to provide the names. The committee asked, the agency declined. Senator Church stated publicly that what the committee had uncovered was probably only the tip of the iceberg. Now imagine two parallel timelines running through the 1950s and 60s. On one timeline, the American public is reading its morning newspaper. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek. The reader trusts these institutions. They are the fourth estate, the independent check on government power. The reader believes that what appears in these pages has been gathered and reported by journalists whose primary loyalty is to the truth. On the other timeline, running simultaneously, invisibly, on the other side of the same printed page, the CIA is placing stories, shaping narratives, and using some of those very same institutions as instruments of American foreign policy. In 1977, Carl Bernstein, the same Carl Bernstein who had broken the Watergate story, published a 25,000-word investigation in Rolling Stone magazine titled The CIA and the Media. What he found expanded the Church Committee's numbers dramatically. Bernstein reported that over 400 American journalists had secretly carried out CIA assignments over a 25-year period. Of those, 200 to 250 were working journalists, reporters, editors, correspondents, who simultaneously held press positions and performed intelligence functions. He named organizations. The New York Times, which the CIA considered its most valuable press relationship, CBS, described as the agency's most valuable broadcasting asset. Time and Life magazines, Newsweek, The Washington Post. And here is the detail that completes the picture. Even while the Church Committee was holding its hearings, even while Congress was publicly investigating the CIA's media relationships, the agency maintained active ties with between 75 and 90 journalists. The investigation, did not stop the practice. The investigation was happening alongside the practice. The CIA's media influence extended far beyond planting stories in American newspapers. Through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an organization founded in 1950, run by CIA agent Michael Josselson from 1950 to 1967. The agency operated a global propaganda network of extraordinary scope. The Congress for Cultural Freedom maintained offices in 35 countries. It published more than 20 magazines. It held art exhibitions. It sponsored international conferences. It funded literary journals. It promoted abstract expressionism, jazz, and modernist literature. Not because the CIA had developed an appreciation for the avant-garde, but because these art forms represented the kind of creative freedom that the Soviet Union suppressed, and promoting them was a weapon in the cultural Cold War. The most prominent of the Congress's publications was Encounter magazine, based in London. For nearly 2 decades, Encounter was considered one of the finest intellectual journals in the English-speaking world. Its contributors included some of the most distinguished writers, philosophers, and political thinkers of the era. It was covertly funded by the CIA and MI6. This was not speculation then, and it is not speculation now. Thomas Braden, a former CIA officer who had overseen the agency's cultural programs, admitted it publicly in a 1967 article in the Saturday Evening Post. The CIA's own website confirms the agency's role in funding the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The unraveling began in February of 1967 when Ramparts magazine, a small left-leaning publication based in San Francisco, published an exposé revealing that the CIA had been secretly funding the National Student Association through a series of foundation cutouts. The story triggered a cascade of revelations about CIA funding of cultural, academic, and media organizations around the world. At the center of the original network was a man named Frank Wisner, the first director of the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, the division responsible for covert action. Wisner reportedly compared his propaganda operation to a mighty Wurlitzer, the massive theater organ that could produce the sounds of an entire orchestra from a single set of keys. One person, all the lavas, an entire symphony of influence produced from a single console. By the 1950s, an estimated 3,000 CIA employees were engaged in propaganda efforts. 3,000 people working for the United States government, whose job was to shape what the world believed. In 1976, in response to the Church Committee's findings, CIA Director George H.W. Bush issued a policy directive prohibiting paid or contractual relationships with accredited journalists. The loopholes were immediate and obvious. The policy did not cover unaccredited Americans in media organizations, a category that included executives, freelancers, stringers, and anyone without a formal press credential. Fewer than half of the approximately 50 journalist relationships identified by the Church Committee would have been terminated under the new policy. The CIA would continue to welcome voluntary, unpaid cooperation from journalists who wished to share information or assist the agency of their own accord. The distinction between a paid relationship and an unpaid one, between a contractual obligation and a voluntary favor, is the kind of line that exists on paper and dissolves in practice. No enforcement mechanism was created. The policy was a directive from the CIA director, not a law passed by Congress, not a regulation with penalties for violation, not a structural reform that changed how the agency operated. It was a promise made by the same institution that had been caught doing the thing it was now promising to stop. And that is the nature of Operation Mockingbird, or whatever name you choose to give the broader practice. It was not a single operation with a beginning and an end. It was a relationship between the people who gathered the news and the people who wanted to control what the news said. And relationships, unlike operations, do not have declassification dates. The Church Committee found the tip of the iceberg in 1975. Carl Bernstein found more of the iceberg in 1977. The 1976 policy directive placed a thin sheet of ice back over the surface. What lies beneath? The full scope of the CIA's influence on what Americans read, watched, and believed during the formative decades of the Cold War remains, in Senator Church's words, below the waterline, unexamined, unaccounted for, and, for all anyone can prove, unfinished. The name comes from the Italian word Gladio, the short, double-edged sword carried by Roman gladiators. It is a fitting name for what it describes, because the operation it refers to was, like that sword, hidden until the moment of use. And, like that sword, it cut in both directions. Operation Gladio was a NATO-wide network of secret, stay-behind armies established across Western Europe during the early years of the Cold War. The premise was straightforward. If the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, conventional military forces might be overrun. In that event, trained paramilitary units, pre-positioned in each NATO country, supplied with hidden weapons caches, communications equipment, and intelligence networks, would remain behind enemy lines and conduct sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and intelligence operations against the occupying force. The concept was borrowed from the resistance movements of World War II. The French Maquis, the Italian partisans, the Norwegian resistance. These groups had demonstrated that a well-organized clandestine force operating behind enemy lines could tie down disproportionate numbers of enemy troops and provide critical intelligence to the Allied forces. The Cold War version was more ambitious. Instead of building these networks after an invasion, improvising, recruiting, training under fire, NATO would build them in advance, in peacetime, in secret, across the entire Western alliance. The coordination was handled through two NATO committees that most people have never heard of. The Clandestine Planning Committee, established in 1951, and the Allied Clandestine Committee, established in 1958. These committees brought together representatives from national intelligence services, each country's equivalent of the CIA, or MI6, to coordinate the stay-behind program. The CIA and British MI6 provided the overarching direction. The training was conducted with United States Army Green Berets and British Special Air Service commandos. The weapons, rifles, explosives, communications equipment were stockpiled in hidden caches across the continent, in forests, in bunkers, in church basements, in private homes. And the people recruited into these networks were not just soldiers. They were civilians. Ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, civil servants, professionals, who were vetted, trained, and armed by their national intelligence services, operating under the direction of NATO's clandestine committees, with the knowledge and support of the CIA. The scale was continental. The countries with confirmed stay-behind armies include every major NATO member: Italy, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, and Turkey. But the network extended beyond the alliance. Neutral countries, Austria, Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland, also maintained stay-behind forces. At minimum, 16 countries participated. 16 countries, thousands of operatives, decades of operation. And for more than 40 years, the elected parliaments, the voters, and in many cases, even the prime ministers and presidents of these countries had no idea the networks existed. The story of how Gladio was discovered begins not with an intelligence leak or a whistleblower, but with a judge in Italy investigating a car bombing. In 1984, Judge Felice Casson reopened the investigation into the Pitiano bombing of 1972. On May 31st of that year, a car bomb near the village of Peteano had killed 3 carabinieri, members of the Italian military police, who had been lured to the scene by an anonymous phone call reporting an abandoned vehicle. The original investigation had blamed the Red Brigades, a left-wing terrorist group, and then stalled. For 12 years, the case sat closed. But Casson, reviewing the evidence, found something that the original investigators had either missed or ignored. The explosive used in the bombing was C4, a military-grade plastic explosive that was not available on the Italian commercial market. Casson traced the C4 to NATO stockpiles, specifically to weapons caches that had been pre-positioned as part of a secret paramilitary network embedded within the Italian military intelligence service. The bombing had not been committed by left-wing terrorists. It had been committed using explosives from a NATO-linked secret army. Casson pulled the thread, and the thread led, eventually, to the most politically explosive revelation in post-war European history. In July of 1990, Casson was granted access to the archives of SISMI, the Italian military intelligence service. There, he found a 1959 document from SIFAR, SISMI's predecessor, that proved, in writing, the existence of a NATO-linked secret paramilitary organization operating within Italy. On August 2nd, 1990, the Italian Senate, having learned of Casson's findings, ordered Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti to provide a full explanation within 60 days. Andreotti was one of the most powerful political figures in post-war Italy. He had served as Prime Minister multiple times. He was a consummate insider, a man who had operated at the center of Italian politics for decades. And on August 3rd, 1990, in his first response to the Senate's demand, he confirmed that a NATO-linked secret army had existed in Italy. But the full revelation came on October 24th, 1990. On that date, Andreotti presented the Italian Senate with a 10-page report titled The So-Called Parallel SID, the Gladio Case. The report described a stay-behind network that had been established in the late 1940s and maintained continuously since then. Andreotti listed 622 civilian members, though the actual membership was estimated at roughly 1,500. He stated that 127 weapons caches had been identified and dismantled. And then, Andreotti made a statement that he immediately had to correct. He initially claimed that the secret army had been dissolved. He then corrected himself and admitted that it was still active. Still active in 1990. More than 4 decades after its creation. 4 decades during which the elected governments of Italy, the parliaments, the presidents, the prime ministers who preceded Andreotti, had, in most cases, been unaware of its existence. Andreotti's revelation triggered a cascade of admissions across Europe. Within days, Belgium confirmed the existence of SDR-A8, its own stay-behind network. Other countries followed. One by one, the governments of Western Europe acknowledged what had been hidden in their basements, their forests, and their intelligence archives for 40 years. On November 22, 1990, the European Parliament passed a formal resolution condemning the existence of the stay-behind armies. The resolution sharply criticized NATO and the United States. It called for full investigations in each country. It demanded the complete dismantlement of the networks. Neither full investigation nor complete dismantlement has ever occurred. And this is where the story of Gladio becomes something more than an interesting footnote in Cold War history, because the stay-behind armies were built to fight the Soviets. But there is substantial evidence, particularly in Italy, that they were used for something else entirely. The strategy of tension. In Italy, the decades between the late 1960s and the early 1980s were marked by a series of devastating terrorist attacks, bombings, shootings, mass casualty events that terrorized the Italian public and destabilized Italian politics. The deadliest of these was the Bologna train station bombing of August 2, 1980. A bomb concealed in a suitcase in the main waiting room killed 85 people and injured more than 200. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Italian history. For years, for decades, these attacks were attributed to left-wing extremists, the Red Brigades, the armed proletarian nuclei. The narrative was clear. Italy was under assault from communist terrorists, and the response required stronger security measures, harder policing, and a firmer hand from the state. But as the investigations deepened, as judges like Felice Casson pulled at the threads, a different picture emerged. The Piazza Fontana bombing of December 12, 1969, 17 people killed in a bank in central Milan, had initially been blamed on anarchists. One suspect, Giuseppe Pinelli, died under mysterious circumstances while in police custody, falling from a fourth-floor window during interrogation. Decades later, investigations revealed connections between the bombing and neo-fascist groups with ties to Italian military intelligence, and through military intelligence, to the Gladio network. The strategy of tension, as it came to be known, was the theory, supported by substantial judicial findings in Italy, that some of these attacks were carried out not by left-wing groups, but by right-wing operatives connected to the stay-behind networks, with the aim of creating public fear that would push the population toward conservative, authoritarian, and anti-communist political positions. The logic was circular and devastating. Secret armies built to defend democracy from Soviet invasion were allegedly used to commit acts of terrorism against the very populations they were meant to protect, in order to manipulate those populations' political choices. Italian courts have convicted individuals with Gladio connections in several terrorism cases. The full extent of the connections, how high the orders went, how much NATO and the CIA knew, how many of the attacks were false flag operations versus genuine acts of extremism, remains a matter of ongoing historical investigation. And the international response to these revelations has been, predictably, silence. NATO's official position on Gladio is denial. The CIA's official position is neither confirm nor deny, the standard formulation that means everything and nothing simultaneously. Despite the European Parliament's 1990 resolution, despite Andreotti's public testimony, despite judicial findings in Italy and Belgium and other countries, the full history of the stay-behind armies has never been officially compiled, investigated, or disclosed by the governments that created and maintained them. The most comprehensive study of the Gladio network was conducted not by a government, but by a Swiss academic, Dr. Daniele Ganser of the University of Basel, whose 2005 book, NATO's Secret Armies, remains the most thorough English-language account of the program. The CIA's response to Ganser's research was that his sourcing was largely secondary. That criticism is accurate, and it is accurate because the primary sources remain classified. The CIA criticizes a researcher for relying on secondary sources while simultaneously refusing to release the primary sources that would either confirm or refute his findings. The institution that built the network critiques the historian who tried to document it for not having access to documents that the institution itself keeps locked away. This is the accountability void in its purest form. The evidence exists. The governments that created it control access to it, and the investigation is perpetually incomplete because the investigators are denied the tools they would need to complete it. 16 countries. 4 decades, thousands of operatives, hidden weapons, secret training camps, and a continent's worth of elected officials who are told nothing about the armies hidden in their own backyards. The Cold War ended in 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The invasion scenario that had justified the stay-behind armies never materialized. The secret soldiers were never called to fight the enemy they had been trained to resist. But the networks existed. The weapons existed, the people existed, and the question of what they did, while they waited, while the invasion that never came failed to arrive, year after year, decade after decade, is the question that the Gladio file leaves unanswered. Andreotti said the network was still active in 1990. He corrected himself in real time on the record before the Italian Senate. Still active, still armed, still hidden. That was 36 years ago, and no government has ever confirmed that the dismantlement the European Parliament demanded has been completed. The Gladius was a short sword, double-edged, designed to be concealed until the moment of need. The Roman legions carried it at the hip, under the shield, invisible until it was drawn. The networks that bore its name may have been the same. Hidden, waiting, drawing their edge against an enemy that changed, or perhaps was never the real enemy at all. The desk lamp casts its circle. 10 files, all open now. The pages spread across the dark wood, like a map of something that was never supposed to be seen. And in the silence that follows the last file, in the quiet after Gladio, after Mockingbird, after Iran-Contra, after Ajax, after the psychics, and the poison gun, and the spy cat, and the government brothel, and the proposal to bomb American cities, and the 20-year program that tried to break the human mind. In that silence, a question forms. Not the question you might expect. The question is not, how could they? Because the answer to that question is in every file. They could, because no one stopped them. They could because the Cold War provided a permission structure that transformed the unthinkable into the operational. They could because the systems of oversight that were supposed to prevent exactly these kinds of abuses were either non-existent, deliberately circumvented, or staffed by people who believed that the mission justified the methods. They could because power, in the absence of accountability, will always expand to fill the space available to it. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural observation. It is what institutions do. They grow. They protect themselves. They redefine their boundaries outward. And they do this not because the people within them are evil, though some of them were, but because the incentive structure of any institution rewards expansion and punishes restraint. The men who ran MKUltra believed they were protecting America from Soviet mind control. The generals who signed the Northwoods memo believed they were protecting America from a communist Cuba. The operatives who overthrew Mossadegh believed they were protecting the free world from Soviet encroachment. The agents who ran Midnight Climax believed they were gathering intelligence that might save American lives. The scientists who wired a cat believed they were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And in each case, in every single file on this desk, the belief in the mission created a moral vacuum in which the methods were never seriously questioned. The people inside the system could not see what they were doing because they were too close to it. The people outside the system could not see what was being done because the system was designed to be invisible. That is the real lesson of these 10 files. Not that governments do terrible things in secret, though they do. Not that power corrupts, though it does. But that the most dangerous operations are the ones that feel, to the people carrying them out, like the right thing to do. The normalization of the unthinkable does not happen through villains in dark rooms. It happens through professionals in offices, following procedures, filing reports, and going home to their families at the end of the day. Sidney Gottlieb went home to his goat farm in Virginia after a day of supervising drug experiments on unwitting subjects. George Hunter White went home from his government brothel and wrote about how much fun it was. Oliver North went home from the White House after shredding evidence of illegal arms sales and, by most accounts, believed he was serving his country. Nathan Gordon defied a presidential order to destroy biological weapons and, according to his testimony, simply could not bear to see his work undone. The system did not need conspiracy. It needed compartmentalization. It needed the kind of institutional architecture where each person sees only their piece, where no one has to confront the whole picture, and where the question, should we be doing this, is never asked because the question, can we do this, has already been answered yes. And then, when the operations are exposed, when the files are declassified, when the committees hold hearings, when the testimony is given under oath, the system has one more defense, the most effective one of all: amnesia. McNamara had zero recollection of Northwoods. Gottlieb could not recall the details of MKUltra. Reagan did not remember authorizing arms for hostages. Gordon claimed he never received the order to destroy the toxins. NATO denies Gladio. The CIA neither confirms nor denies. The most common phrase in the history of American intelligence may be, "I do not recall." And perhaps that is the final irony. The intelligence community, the institution that exists to know, to gather information, to remember what others forget. That institution, when asked to account for its own actions, suddenly discovers that its memory is unreliable. The people who built the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in human history cannot seem to remember what they did with it. The files remember. That is the thing about paper. It has weight. And weight, eventually, sinks through every flaw built to support it. MKUltra's records were destroyed, but 20,000 pages survived a filing error. Northwoods was classified for 35 years, but the JFK Records Review Board found it. Iran-Contra's documents were shredded, but Fawn Hall could not carry everything in her boots. George White's letter survived at Stanford. Andreotti's revelation could not be unspoken. The church committee photographs could not be untaken. The record is never complete. It is never supposed to be complete, but it is always enough to tell you that the story you are told, the official version, the public record, the version without the classified appendix, was not the whole truth. It never is. And that is perhaps the most useful thing these files leave behind. Not the specific operations, though they are worth knowing. Not the specific names, though they should not be forgotten. But the understanding that the gap between the public narrative and the classified reality is not an accident. It is a feature. It is the space in which power operates most freely, most dangerously, and with the least accountability. When you know that gap exists, when you understand that the surface is never the full story, you have not become a conspiracy theorist. You have become a person who reads the fine print. And the fine print in the history of intelligence is where the truth has always lived. Tonight, we open 10 files, 10 operations that sound like fiction and are not. 10 chapters in the long, ongoing, never quite finished story of what happens when power operates in the dark. Tomorrow, there will be new files, new operations, new revelations that were classified yesterday and will be declassified in 30 years, or 50, or never. The system continues. The permission structure adapts. The methods evolve. And somewhere, in a room you will never enter, someone is making a decision that you will not learn about until it is too late to change the outcome. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the structural reality of how classified power operates in a democracy. And the only defense against it, the only mechanism that has ever worked, is the stubborn, inconvenient, occasionally dangerous insistence on knowing what was done in your name. The files on this desk are closed now. 10 of them, all confirmed, all documented, all real. But Mr. Calder's desk is large, and the archive behind him is deep, and there are always more files. The lamp dims, the paper settles, the night holds its breath. Sleep well, midnight magnates. And if you dream of files stamped in red, of classified truths dissolving in the light, know that the stories have been told, the weight has been shared. The secrets, for tonight at least, are yours. Rest now. We will open more files another night. But tonight, the desk is clear. Good night.